name's Emily Sinkhorn, Environmental Services Director for the city. We have several city staff here to support the workshop, as well as consultants from GHD and our technical assistance provider, RCAC. And before we start on the presentation, I'm just going to have our mayor, Alex Stillman, is going to say a few words. But just for, again, restrooms are down this corridor. There are multiple emergency exits if that is needed. We are repairing stairs through this door, so all the other emergency exits are open. Just wanted to say that. Great, and I'll pass it to you, Mayor.
Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. You know, I brought the Marsh Builders book with me because Sharon Levy took it upon herself to really go back and do the history on how we got to where we are today with the Arcata Marsh. And so it's really interesting to read it. So for myself, and there's Bob Gearhart, we were involved in it in the 1970s when this all came about. In 1974 is when we had a council with enough council members that were really willing to look at an alternative system than the original one that was proposed through Hubwa, which was going to take all our sewage and take it to Eureka and basically give us an outfall into the ocean. And that was the time where you read all the time, what tertiary treatment? Not that this is tertiary treatment, but that was the buzzword in the days in the 70s. So it was hard to believe that we weren't going to be more innovative and do something around that. So needless to say, tonight we're here to share updates about potential adaptation strategies for the Arcata Marsh Treatment Facility in the near and the long term. So they're asking all of us to think in the long term when we get together in our groups and think about that scenario and what that might mean. In the 1980s, the city took that bold step to demonstrate how wastewater can be future enhanced through natural systems and marshes, which led to the creation of the beloved, and I love that too, Arcata Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary. And we have members here of the Friends of the Arcata Marsh, and they were a group that started when that whole project came about, and they still work on it, and they're docents and members of the board and also members of the organization. So the current project is helping Arcata to again look boldly towards the future. This is feasibility study and other current adaptation efforts represent the city's commitment to planning for future generations, stewarding our resources and enabling reliable essential infrastructure. So I know that we have came up with a whole marsh system, and that's something, you know, I still love that idea, and it was something that came through many, many meetings with our professors from Humboldt State that helped make this work. So I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca, who's going to move us forward. And thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate seeing you all here. Let me take that out of your way. Excellent. Oh, did I get it?
That's okay.
Okay.
We'll survive. Very good. Thank you, Mayor Stillman. Thank you, Director Sinkhorn. Thank you to the public for coming here and coming out and being so interested. As people come in, don't worry, there's seats in the front row. Feel free to come on in. Our presentation today will be about a half an hour, a little bit more potentially, and then we're going to go into some breakout groups. So with that, I'm going to get it started. Wanted to touch, these first couple slides are on what we're doing and kind of overall of the project. So we're working on the Arcata Wastewater Treatment Facility feasibility study, the purpose of which is to investigate and evaluate strategies for protecting, relocating, or otherwise adapting the city's wastewater facilities to maintain safety and regulatory compliance and considering long-term climate change effects from flooding and coastal hazards. The city's undertaking this comprehensive planning feasibility study in part to identify long-term, cost-effective pathways for wastewater compliance. This effort prepares the city to evaluate future costs and secure funding for future improvements. Further, the city's goals for this project are to inform the city on options to move forward on levee resilience improvements around the treatment facility. You may have heard of that project, so we're looking into that further. Also to identify multiple top-ranking alternatives to support future decisions. The funding for this work is being paid for through the State Water Resources Control Board through a grant being administered by the Rural Community Assistance Corporation, or RCAC. And we've got several of their members here tonight, and we're glad to have them up here. And then we're also getting support and cooperation from the Coastal Commission and the Regional Water Quality Control Board. Just a review of what our scope is in this feasibility study. We've done some background information review, completed a coastal hazards risk assessment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Complete adaptation strategy development, alternatives analysis, identification of top rank alternatives, a cost analysis and funding plan, and then put together a final feasibility study with the findings. It's important to note that a final alternative is not, will not necessarily be selected or will not be selected as part of this study. The goal is to pull together the information and then have the city have the time to review it and make decisions. Right now, we're at this alternatives analysis stage of the project. Many of you are probably familiar with what goes on in a wastewater system, but thought it's good to just sort of review. We're starting with, everybody's got your house, your home, your toilet, you flush a toilet, it goes out into a series of collection system pipes. Those pipes are joined up by different manholes. Try and maximize gravity in your wastewater system so it'll kind of go downhill, and at a certain point you'll need a lift station to pump it back up. Eventually it goes to a treatment plant, and then here in Arcata goes through the enhancement marshes, eventually discharges to the brackish marsh, which is tidally flushed to Humboldt Bay. And here's just another image of the city's treatment facilities. You can see the main treatment facility, the oxidation ponds that are part of the treatment facility, the 3 enhancement marshes, and then the brackish marsh where we get the tidal flushing to the bay. Wanted to touch a little bit on timeline, right? Because some of the things that we're talking about today are very sort of long-term in terms of what we're trying to look into the future for. So today, the city is currently completing phase 1 improvements at their wastewater treatment plant. In the near term, the city looks to be implementing phase 2, which will have additional water quality improvements. Some of those will be based on the results and findings from the existing upgrade. The city's also looking at a proposed levee augmentation project, so raising the levees around that, and you saw on the previous slide, the oxidation ponds and the treatment plant, so protecting that from coastal flooding. And then you can see here along the bottom, we've got the feasibility study that we're working on. That's going to lead to providing information to the city for selection of adaptation alternatives and eventually adaptation implementation. And you can see along the bottom, we've got 3 time frames, and you'll see those come up a lot in our presentation today. We've got what we're calling the near term, so that's approximately the next 30 years or so till about 2055. We've got the midterm, which is about till 2075, and then the long term, which goes out into the start of the next century. Wanted to review with you all here today the work that was done on the coastal hazards risk assessment. This work is in line with the work that the city's doing on the local coastal program. So those are consistent activities. The coastal hazards risk assessment included several components. It included an assessment of changes in sea level rise and coastal hazards over time, specific to Humboldt Bay while using the latest science from Ocean Protection Council. The evaluation of asset vulnerability, the evaluation of asset adaptive capacity, the likelihood that assets are going to be flooded, the consequences if flooded, and then a risk of asset damage failure based on a combination of those things. And we'll have another slide that touches on that. So wanted to bring this slide up so that folks understand a little bit more about the information that we're using to conduct this assessment. So the Ocean Protection Council, in their latest guidance, has developed 5 different emission scenarios. And each of those 5 different emission scenarios results in different levels or predicted levels of sea level rise. And you can see along the bottom here, we've got our midterm, our near term, midterm, and long-term components. For this analysis, the city is using the intermediate emissions scenario, so that's the one highlighted in yellow up here. And it's important to note, again, these are a lot of predictive items. If it ends up that sea level rise is faster than that intermediate scenario, essentially what that means is that adaptation needs to happen sooner. But for the presentation that you're going to see today, we're using this intermediate emissions scenario. One of the things that was part of the study was a risk assessment. So risk was assessed qualitatively based on the likelihood of a flood event causing an impact. So if a piece of infrastructure gets flooded, how damaging is that to the city's ability to provide wastewater services, and the consequences to the wastewater asset if flooded. So if you look at this risk matrix evaluation, you have in the very far corner, you have very high risk. If you've got flooding is very likely and the impacts or consequences are very catastrophic. And that's in comparison to the bottom left corner where you've got very unlikely to be flooded, and if flooded, very insignificant consequences. And then we've got some examples of how this was used to assess parts of the city system. The city is conducting a separate study that's looking at more assets. This is focused on the wastewater here. So this looks at the treatment facility and the Arcata marsh risk. This is without installing the levee that is currently proposed. So today, most of these items have very low risk, but looking into the near term, both the site and facility access, the essential treatment facilities, and the marshes become medium risk. Moving into the midterm, both the treatment facilities and enhancement marshes jump up to the high risk. And this is in comparison, so the next slide is sort of what if the city were to build the levee. So you can see here, this is a levee just around the treatment facility, but it protects the essential facilities to at least the midterm with very low risk and into the beginning of the next century for long-term risk. Next, I'd like to talk about some results from, we had a meeting in November of last year. So we asked for public input November of last year, and we've been taking that into consideration as we've been moving the study forward, but wanted to have a little report back to the community about what we heard. So the goals of that meeting were to inform the community on the efforts that the city is leading to address sea level risk and hazard mitigation as it relates to the treatment facility and the treatment marshes. We discussed and solicited input from the community on wastewater discharge infrastructure, alternatives, the importance of wastewater discharge continuing to have a beneficial reuse in the environment, and the priorities and wastewater system considerations. So in terms of wastewater discharge infrastructure, some of the key takeaways, and I'm just gonna read along with me. It's a lot of words. Strong support for protection of the Arcata marsh and retention of the enhancement benefits it brings to the environment, with concerns about protection into the future. There was interest in the potential for land application to increase local beneficial reuse and then reduce discharge to the bay, but there were also concerns related to increases in groundwater levels. There was interest from the community in partnering with the Harbor District on use of the Redwood Marine Terminal's existing ocean outfall. And there was interest in incorporating decentralized systems to reduce the load to the primary wastewater treatment plant. And then in terms of beneficial uses of effluent in the environment, like the existing marsh system already does, folks were interested in the sustainability and environmental protection were central themes, with strong support for using marshlands, eco-levees, and agricultural reuse. There were significant concerns about the environmental impact of ocean outfalls and groundwater injection and the potential byproducts from land application. Participants showed an interest in innovative technologies like composting toilets and small-scale decentralized solutions, but emphasized the need for careful consideration of location and environmental sustainability for each method. Lastly, participants emphasized the top priority of protecting existing enhancement marshlands and suggested further research on their beneficial uses. Participants also proposed integrating levees to protect marshes from environmental threats. Okay, and just so people know, I forgot to start my timer, so There you go. Okay, I'm doing good. A little timer in the corner, I forgot. So this list here looks at the relative importance to the community. It's not to say that number 6 isn't important, but if you were here at that meeting, we had a station where we asked folks, what's most important to them in terms of different criteria that the city has some flexibility on. There's obviously criteria like regulatory compliance that the city has no, you must have regulatory compliance. So the number one thing that was important to the community that came out of that was the use of natural systems as part of the treatment process. Costs, so keeping the system low cost to the community. Folks were interested in incorporating new beneficial reuse and ancillary benefits, also maintaining the existing beneficial reuse and ancillary benefits, being proactive to climate change readiness, and staying within the footprint of the existing Arcata wastewater treatment facility was the lowest priority, but again, does not necessarily reflect that it's not a priority. So the city has been looking at multiple types of adaptation strategies. Here's a pretty straightforward overview. A lot of you have probably been involved in different sea level rise and climate activities in the area. So the basic methodologies that we're looking at is protection. So that's creating a physical barrier to prevent the flooding and coastal hazards. Accommodation, so in some cases you can just accommodate the flooding. We'll talk a little bit about those types of strategies. And then lastly, retreat. If you can't protect and you can't accommodate there, you can relocate to outside the flooding areas. I'd like to talk a little bit about the collection system adaptation strategies, and the city's already ahead on this. There's a poster on the wall for folks who are interested, talking about some of the great work that the city has already done on inflow and infiltration reduction, and they've got another project coming up here in the next couple of years. So near-term adaptation strategies for the collection system include, like I just mentioned, inflow and infiltration reduction. So that's lining your pipes so that groundwater isn't getting into your collection pipes and making its way to the treatment plant, and then you're having to treat it and discharge. So if you can reduce the amount of flow getting to your treatment plant, that's helpful. The second is elevating pump stations and electrical components. So like I mentioned, often you're trying to maximize the use of gravity in your collection systems, and so you're having to keep going down, 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 and your pump stations often end up being in some of the lower areas of your community. So there's flood-proofing and elevating electrical so that you don't necessarily have to move that infrastructure, but you can accommodate some localized flooding. Some of your midterm and long-term adaptation strategies are just continued collection system upgrades. And this last one's really paired with some of the treatment and disposal options that we'll look with, is potentially rerouting your collection system for treatment plant relocation. If you move the treatment plant, you got to move the pipes that connect to it. And again, we've got more information about the collection system adaptation strategies over there on the poster, and we're not going to really talk too much more about that in this presentation. So looking at the treatment system adaptation strategy. So in the near term, I mentioned the city's completing their phase 1 wastewater upgrades. Those do include electrical upgrades that include elevating some of the infrastructure above the near-term flood estimate. Also, an option is minor levee improvements. And we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail in the next slide. So this is just intended to give you an overview of what the next slides are going to present. Midterm, long-term adaptation strategies include levee augmentation, so building up that levee around the treatment plant, potentially relocating the treatment plant, and then also looking at potentially decentralized treatment. It's important to note that's not a standalone option. There's not enough need or ability to reduce flows to the point where you could get rid of your treatment plant or your collection system, but they can be part of an overall long-term adaptation strategy. So just a little bit more about the phase 1 improvements. Again, they included elevating essential electrical equipment as well as treatment upgrades. This is an adaptation type strategy, and it addresses the vulnerability of electrical equipment at the existing facility till about 2055, that near-term time frame, against sea level threats, and improves the facilities to meet discharge requirements. And you'll note a lot of these slides have this same format, right? Strategy, adaptation type, and the goal. So another Near-term adaptation strategy of the treatment plant would be minor levee improvements to match the existing grade. So as you can imagine, there's little places where it kind of dips below, and so that would just be going in and sort of beefing up some of those low spots, but not necessarily raising the whole levee. It's an accommodation, considered an accommodation type strategy, and would address the vulnerability wastewater facilities up to approximately the 12-foot level. Moving on to midterm and long-term adaptation strategies. So that's the Arcata Wastewater Treatment Facility Levee Augmentation Project. It is a protection adaptation and would be looking to elevate the existing levee to about 15 feet and add new levee sections to protect the central plant facilities, right? Because water can get in the backside. So the city's plant is currently a little bit vulnerable on the backside. So this project would address that. And then just here's some renderings of what something like that may look like. The city's considering both hard armoring, and the benefit of hard armoring is it has a smaller footprint, but still protects the facility, but also being considered our hybrid green-gray levee augmentation. So that would include some hardened infrastructure, but also then some nature-based solutions, likely like a living shoreline or something on the outside of the plant, may take up a little bit more space into the existing facility. So if the city's not able to protect, the next option that is being considered is to potentially relocate the wastewater treatment facility. This is a retreat alternative, and the goal would be to retreat the treatment facility within a lower elevation range within the city area, similar to the existing facility. So this map that you're seeing here, again, the city's not looking at any specific locations or it hasn't started that work, but that red area sort of indicates the more low-lying areas where you could potentially relocate a wastewater treatment plant. And you can see the existing facilities are there on the bottom in orange. And again, moving into the future, it is anticipated that those facilities could be flooded if not protected. The city also took a look at, what's the kind of land area required if you were to potentially retreat the city's wastewater system. So currently the city's treatment plant is sized for maximum flow around 6 million gallons per day. The city is not, to my understanding, looking to expand the treatment plant. None of this study is looking to expand capacity of the treatment plant. It's really focused on protection and maintaining the regulatory compliance and safety. And you can see there's a range of acreages that would be required. So your very technologically dense membrane bioreactor there would take about 7 acres of land in comparison to lagoons, ponds, or wetland system, which require more area. So looking at about 150 acres. So those are the ranges that the city's looking at when they're considering potential relocation. So that was really the things that the city is looking at in terms of treatment, so some of the near term in terms of accommodation, and then mid and long term, protecting the treatment facility with some type of levee system, and then also potentially retreating. I think something that's really important to the city is the Arcata Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary. One of the things that's important, because this study is going to be read by people who don't live here and aren't necessarily decision makers here. So one of the important things to highlight, I think, is the unique benefits of the marsh. So the marsh system provides this unique freshwater habitat on the shore of Humboldt Bay for multiple species. Clop Lake and the brackish marsh are tidally influenced via tide gates. It creates a unique brackish wetland habitat that's sheltered from large tidal surge events. It provides public recreation, including educational opportunities and over 5 miles of biking and hiking trails. And it provides water quality treatment and the mechanism for the city to comply with the state's enclosed bays and estuaries policy. And that policy is state guidance that essentially says any discharge into an enclosed bay in California has to meet treatment standards and then also has to enhance the bay beyond which it would exist without the discharge. So that's an important component when the city is looking at different discharge alternatives, especially if they're looking to stay in the bay, is maintaining that enhancement component. And right now, the city's marsh complex helps or does meet that requirement. So in terms of wastewater discharge and reuse adaptation strategies, some of the near-term strategies could be rehabilitate the enhancement marsh protection structures. Again, that's potentially filling in some of the low spots. There's some areas of the existing marshes that dip below 10 feet and are pretty vulnerable. Many of you may have been out there for the King Tide events and seen some potential flooding. So there's some opportunities to at least match some of the higher grade. A midterm adaptation strategy is determine the adaptive capacity of the enhancement marshes to saltwater. So how much could they be flooded before change really needs to happen? So it may extend the period of time that the city could use the existing marshes, potentially without a levee, without any sort of relocation. And then we've got the mid to long-term adaptation strategy. So that includes the enhancement marsh levee augmentation, potentially relocating the enhancement marshes a little bit further inland or at a different location, looking at alternative enhancement and continuing the bay discharge. The city has been asked to consider ocean discharge, also looking at surface water discharge and land with some land application. And then also, in the long term, looking if there's opportunities for consolidation with other agencies. Now, there were several disposal options that were presented in November that have since been considered infeasible. Those include groundwater injection. So there's no similar examples permitted in California for wastewater discharge only, simply just injecting it for the sake of getting rid of it. And the need for groundwater injection for preventing saltwater intrusion and things like that is not great here in our area because we have our regional wholesale water supplier. Also, the city would not be able to dispose of all effluent, so a secondary disposal method would still be required, so you're still having to face a lot of the same issues. The next one that was considered infeasible was year-round land discharge. Get a lot of rain up here. And so that alternative was looking at needing over 2,000 acres of land for irrigation and then storage of effluent during the rainy season, pretty much take up the whole Arcata bottoms, did not seem feasible. And lastly was year-round surface water discharge. So this is currently not permitted by the Regional Water Quality Control Board here. They essentially have regulations in place that say no discharge to rivers in the summer. And so the city is not going to pursue that alternative. So then getting a little bit more into detail with the adaptation strategies. So as a near term, I mentioned, so you can see in this graphic here, the areas that are highlighted in orange, those are the areas that are below 10 feet in elevation, and those are the areas that could be filled in to, at least in the near term, protect the marshes from potential flooding. Second one that we talked about was monitor and study the adaptive capacity of the enhancement marshes to overtopping. This is an accommodate nature-based solution. Determine if some of the marshes can actually preserve under future conditions with some overtopping and salt water getting in them. The picture up here was taken by some HSU photographers for the King Tide in 2020. This was a tide height of about 8.5 feet. Similar to the treatment plant, the city could consider a levee augmentation project surrounding the marsh. This is can be a nature-based solution, and this would conserve the marsh wetlands through that end of the next century period. Another option, if the marshes aren't protected or in coordination with some other alternatives, is to continue the bay discharge without the existing enhancement marshes and install a new enhancement type project. So this is just an example. This is not specific to the city, but includes things that could be considered. It's got multi-purpose trails, the bike paths, walking paths, incorporate some stormwater detention and treatment. So there are some innovative nature-based solutions that the city could consider that are different from the marsh. Next is the wastewater discharge to the ocean outfall. This is potentially a long-term adaptation strategy. What's interesting to note on here, and you can see on this graphic, those yellow areas are the state-managed areas, ESHA and BLM land, so you essentially can't put pipelines through there. So if the city were to do some sort of ocean outfall, they could go north, so just south of the mouth of the Mad River. They could also go south and potentially coordinate with the Harbor District and use the Redwood Marine Terminal outfall, or could potentially be looking at a new outfall south of that. So those are options that are just being considered as part of the larger picture. Getting down there, you guys are doing good. Next, we've got another long-term strategy for disposal, which would be a combination of surface water disposal and land application. This is a lot of folks do around here. So the picture down here is the McKinleyville Community Services District. They irrigate those lands. Rio Dell does something similar where they're discharging to the Eel River in the winter and doing land application in the summer. So that's something that's very common here on the North Coast. And yeah, just a little bit more info for that. Really the only surface water body big enough or close enough to Arcata to potentially do that would be the Mad River. So here's a graphic of the Mad River. That blue zone, it could be the potential discharge zone. Below that becomes estuary, and then you're still having to comply with the enclosed bays and estuaries policy. And then above that is the intakes for Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District. So want to stay outside of those. The surface water discharge, as I mentioned, would occur in that winter time period, so from October 1st to May 14th, because we all know that the hydrologic cycle also follows the calendar. At least that's what the regional board tells us. And then in the summer, the city would need, instead of the 2,000 acres, still a pretty significant amount of land, but approximately 600 acres of land would be needed for irrigation of effluent from May 15th through September 30th. And that irrigation area accounts for late season precipitation. It accounts for storage for flow equalization and setbacks from public areas. Lastly, in terms of, and this could be potentially a treatment or a discharge option, would be some type of consolidation. Again, this would be a mid or long-term strategy, but consolidate with other discharges located around Humboldt Bay. So that includes potentially McKinleyville Community Services District, potentially consolidating with the City of Eureka, or potentially consolidating operations with the Humboldt Bay Harbor Recreation and Conservation District. Wanted to key back into the timeline here. So again, we're currently conducting this feasibility study. It's due to be completed the end of this year. And then that information will be turned over to the city for further consideration and discussion. The point was to collect the information and then give the city time to make a decision. So next steps for the feasibility study. So next, so we've developed the different adaptation strategies, is prioritization of those strategies and selection of several alternatives for more detailed analysis. So the information obtained through this public meeting and the one back in November are going to be used to support the prioritization of alternatives. The city is going to go through that for the priority alternatives, look at estimated costs, do a constraints analysis, look at the implementation timelines, because some of these, it's like, hey, if we're going to build something new starting at 2055, it takes a while to get to the point where you can actually build something. So those implementation timelines, a cost-benefit analysis. Next would be an environmental review of the priority alternatives. So this includes identification of future technical studies, including biological, archaeological, groundwater, and then a permitting evaluation, and then completion of the final report in approximately end of this year. And then just as a reminder, this report does not result in one preferred alternative. All of the prioritized alternatives are going to make it to the end of the report and get equal information. So that's the end of the presentation. If you have questions, feel free to come up to us after. I'm going to turn it back over to Emily to talk a little bit about our group activity that I hope everybody's really excited to participate in. We're hoping to get lots of good info.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that very detailed yet very clear overview. I know there is a lot to take in, and our next step is we're going to transition to some small group discussions so we can really glean and have more time to really glean your questions and comments and ideas. So we are going to have 3 different small groups at these tables that are rectangular tables that are set up. The topics of conversation are going to be the same at each table, and we're going to focus on 2 scenarios and really put ourselves into the future and really ask ourselves, what are some things we hope our decision makers, the city, had thought about to make these scenarios a reality? To get into those groups, if you have a blue name tag, you will be over in this corner. If you have a red name tag, you will be in the center table. If you have a name tag that doesn't have blue or red, we'll be at this table. Project team staff are going to pick up some chairs and move them over. If you feel like picking up a chair, that is great too. We will have about 40 minutes in the small groups, and then we will have additional time for questions over at the detailed posters. Again, a key thing I want to emphasize is that your questions, unanswered questions, ideas, comments that we're gathering today will really help us inform finalizing the feasibility study, but also how this study is presented to the City Council for future decision making. So thank you again for being here. We'll start to transition to those tables. If you don't know what table, you'll just go to a table that has less people at it. Thank you.